So the history of Comet, 1946 started, 71 years. How have you managed to keep the profit going for all those years?
I think organizational culture is the crux of it. It's not something that you can do through once-off initiatives. It's got to be something that's inherent in the approach to business. And we've had a very long-term CEOs, board members, even investors, and that allows you to really focus on long-term goals and not just deal with a year-to-year approach to life. And one of the things that you can only achieve in a very long-term approach is establishing an organizational culture that's very strong. So we're quite obsessive about organizational culture because ultimately we say, well, that's what ultimately will drive the way that people behave within Comair. And the way we need people to behave is to have a fairly healthy paranoia for inflation, because we can't pass on cost increases simply through airfares. It just doesn't work in aviation. So even if you look on a global level, the International Air Traffic Organization identified that over the past 40 years, the real cost of air travel has come down by 70%. Now, in South Africa, because our inflation rate is so much higher, we've worked out that the real cost of air travel has come down 70% in only 15 years. So basically, we're sitting with about 1.5% a year revenue growth, or ticket price growth, and about 9% a year cost inflation. So every single year, you've got to take out 7.5% cost inflation from the business. And when you only got a 4% margin, if you miss out 1 year, you're already straight into minus 3.5% margin next year. So you have to have an absolutely consistent delivery on removing cost inflation, and you can't do that with once-off initiatives. It's got to be inherent in the business culture.
You almost need a chartered accountant running the business.
Yeah, almost.
And some of the leaders, the top leaders that have come before you to lay the platform.
Well, our current chairman was CEO for 30 years, and he's now chairman. So I think now in total he's been involved in Comair for about 50 years now in total. We've had 4 CEOs in 71 years. So some real long tenure in top leadership, and it just means that you've got a long-term vision. And in aviation, where you're buying assets that you're going to operate for 20 years, and you have to consider what are the implications when you have to dispose of that asset in 20 years' time, at the time when you purchase the asset or you decide to lease or buy. You really have to have an approach where you're not just concerned about your own tenure for maybe 3 or 4 years. You're thinking about that you might actually be here in 20 years' time when you sell that asset.
So you obviously need to have a long-term vision.
You've got to have a very long-term view, and I think it creates enormous value to have such a long-term perspective on business. And we do see it as being fairly unique. And if you look at most organizations, particularly in the US, to a degree in Europe as well, there's such a pressure on short-term investment from the investment community and short-term deliverables, that we very often look at decisions that are taken and we think, but that's really a bad decision. It's going to deliver profits next year, but in year 3, 4, 5, it's going to kill you. And it's because of this push at the moment, in particular, from investors to just see immediate returns.
Obviously, investment is key in your aircraft that you purchased. The fuel efficiency there is a real game changer for you.
Yeah. And that's one of the biggest factors in eliminating that inflation, is the fleet renewal, because the kind of efficiencies we've seen coming through in technology are enormous. So if you take, for example, the 737-800s we've recently purchased, they've replaced older 737-300s and 400s. The fuel saving per seat is around 26%. So you've taken a quarter of your fuel cost out with a new airplane. So it's and a part of that, only about 6% of that is your hourly fuel burn, and the other 20% is because you've increased the size of the airplane. So you're spreading the fuel burn over more seats. So your real competitive edge in terms of your pricing is effectively a 26% improvement of your fuel cost. So look, for the most part, you never get to see it, because all you're doing is taking out your inflation so that you can match that very small ticket price increase. But if you don't do it, you're out of business.
And it's interesting you said you're hoping that, or not hoping, but a rise in fuel price wouldn't be bad for your business.
Not at all. I mean, when we started taking the decisions on acquiring brand new aircraft, we were sitting at a fuel price. This was originally in 2008 when we started talking about it. That's when we saw that oil price spike to $140, only for a short time. But it was a good warning sign to say this could, and at the time we thought that's where it's going to stay, But it only happened for a short while, but it was a good warning to say, well, this is where it could actually go. And so when we started taking delivery of aircraft in around 2012, 2013, there were quite a lot of questions raised, because by that time the oil price had already come down dramatically, and we're sitting again back at crazy stuff that we'd never dreamt of, $40 a barrel. And the question was raised, well, was it actually worth buying new airplanes when we're now sitting at $40 a barrel? But obviously, still 26% of $40 a barrel is a good saving. But the real benefit is that eventually the oil price will go up again. Everyone goes through these resource cycles, and you'll get to the point where the exploration that's taken place has been so little over the past few years because the price has been so low, that supply will start to reduce, and it will get to the point where in order to do more exploration anyway is to have a higher oil price. So it will get there, and at that point, we're going to see the real benefit in meaningful numbers, really, really meaningful numbers. So yes, it's a longer term game again. It's not about what's going to deliver the results this year, next year. It's about what happens in 6, 7, 8 years' time when the oil price goes up.
And if you look, say, 50 years down the line, you look at the UK banning petrol cars, is it realistic to have an alternative fuel in the aeroplane?
No one's come up with anything feasible yet. It's a very difficult environment to bring in a different power technology. Maybe someone's going to come up with something so dramatically innovative in energy storage that you will actually get to a point where you can produce an electric aeroplane. But at the moment, there's no technology that's even close on the horizon. So I think we're going to be sitting with jet fuel for quite a while to come.
And that's obviously going to put a tremendous strain on your competitors when that price eventually goes up. That could sink a few companies.
Well, we've seen it sink quite a few airlines in the past. And it's a combination of factors. So on the one side, the fact that we have such high cost inflation in South Africa, but we still have the same kind of ticket price inflation as the rest of the world. There's a reason for that, and the reason for that is that we've had state-owned airlines that haven't had to worry about full cost recovery. And therefore, our gap between cost inflation and ticket price inflation is quite bizarre. If you're in Europe and you're sitting with 2% cost inflation, 1.5% ticket price inflation, you've got to make up 0.5%. So what? But the issue here is that we have had state-owned airlines that just haven't had that same pressure to have to recover cost. So they've constrained the ticket price inflation, and consequently a lot of airlines have gone out of business for that reason alone, in that the gap is so big and they can't find ways, and they don't have the balance sheet to actually invest in new aircraft to compensate, etc. So a lot of carriers have basically gone out of business just because they haven't been able to invest in new technology to take out the inflation.
And the SAA's woes, is there any light at the end of the tunnel for them, or is that ship going down?
Look, I don't think it'll go down because if you look at most of Africa, most African countries have still got national carriers, as much as and they suck out a lot more of GDP and tax resources than what SAA sucks out, and yet they continue going. And the countries that don't have national carriers and have got no reason to go and do it are pursuing the establishment of new national carriers, even though the last one went bust. So there seems to be quite an obsession in Africa that you've got to have a national carrier. So I think for that reason alone, SAA is going to be around for a long time. Even if billions are poured into it, it'll be there. But the reality is that the world in which SAA used to be feasible has moved on dramatically. And on the international routes, globalization has taken over. The likes of an Emirates and the Turkish have got global positioning that nobody else can match. And therefore they can establish the economies of scale and the cost per seat that nobody else can match. And particularly when you've got South Africa sitting at the very southern tip of a continent where there's no hub potential. It's just the world's moved on. We're not in that game anymore where we had sanctions and where we had a handful of carriers serving South Africa and SAA was the dominant carrier to the rest of the world. It's just that world is gone. Regionally, we used to have the situation where very few carriers serviced Africa, and therefore all the African traffic used to come via Johannesburg to go to the rest of the world. That's also history. Now you've got Emirates serving 25 odd locations in Africa and Turkish serving 45 locations in Africa. So if you want to go to the rest of the world, your best option is to jump on an Emirates or a Turkish flight, or even Ethiopian is a better location than Johannesburg. So that piece of the business is gone. And then domestically, basically, domestic aviation has been privatized. SA is now on 23% market share domestically. So the world has moved on in a very big way, and it doesn't really matter how much cost you try and take out of SA today. The business model and the globalization has changed the demand. So you can do what you like with the supply side of SA and the cost structure of SA. The demand is different.
And if they got rid of SA and just kept the mango part, would they turn a profit then?
Maybe if they kept a good, stable, commercially rational mango, maybe they could. I suspect they might just kind of get to break even. But yeah, it's all politics versus the reality of the world. I think that's the challenge.
Exactly. You can't make political decisions for the economic outcomes.
Yeah.
And the level of taxation at airport level, is that a fair price?
It has come down significantly in the last year. We had a massive spike in airport taxes due to the World Cup in 2010, and the amount of infrastructure and the quality of infrastructure that was built to accommodate the World Cup, and it almost went beyond accommodating the World Cup. It was a binge, and unfortunately the regulatory pricing model for the airports is that they get a guaranteed return on investment. So basically, the more they spend, the more profit they can make. So I think they took advantage of this environment where government was supporting any capex spend for the sake of the World Cup, and they probably overbuilt a bit. But now that cycle has come to an end, they work in 5-year permission periods, and the capex base is becoming depreciated. They had quite a big adjustment this year on the airport tariffs. So we're back to, I think, a realistic number. I suspect that the big challenge going forward is that, like all other state-owned enterprises, the airports companies do rely on government guarantees to a large extent to back up their borrowings. And so I think that's going to be a challenge because the banks aren't that enamored with government guarantees anymore.
Speaking of growth, are you in favour of the extension of the Cape Town airport?
Yeah, look, anything that's going to encourage foreign tourism into the country and get the volumes of tourism into the country should really be encouraged. And unfortunately, there are very few departments in government that actually cooperate to improve tourism in totality. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got transport that's protecting SAA, or Treasury protecting SAA, and that in itself actually limits the amount of foreign carriers that are allowed to fly into South Africa. So the foreign guys are smiling because they know they're not going to get more competition on their routes. They can keep their airfares quite nice and high, which is ultimately bad for tourism in South Africa. Then you've got Home Affairs, which goes off on its own tangent and basically tells everyone in the world, don't come to South Africa because we're going to get you here when you try and enter through immigration. So all these visa requirements, etc., really set us back tremendously. But at least AXA has realised that we need the infrastructure from an airport perspective to accommodate foreign carriers, and yeah, hopefully it pays off. But we're not going. I think the issue is really we're not going to see it necessarily pay off in AXA. We're going to see it pay off in the bigger tourism industry, and I think that's probably the biggest challenge we're facing these days, is that there just isn't enough coordination of the big picture in government to say yes, we're going to incur a cost over here, but the benefit in a different area of government or a different area of the economy is going to be so big. So it's almost the challenge has almost become, how do you deal with transfer pricing between government departments so that you don't end up with stupid decisions in one department just for the sake of protecting that department's finances.
There needs to be more synergy.
You need synergy, and it needs to be run. And I know that there are other obligations of government, but you do need to have some perspective of running it like a business, particularly for the sake of bringing money into the economy, because if you don't bring the money into the economy, you can't disperse it for any other purpose. So it's a big component of being, and I think it's the same with running a business. I mean, we have all kinds of obligations to our own staff, for example, around providing them with bursaries and helping their kids to study and all that kind of stuff. But if we don't make a profit, we can't do any of that. And I mean, that may be very simplistic, but we need some good business sense in government.
Does democracy lend itself to good business sense?
Yeah, I do sometimes question whether democracy is the best model ultimately.
Because you could never have 3 CEOs in 70 years.
No, exactly.
4 CEOs.
I think the the benign dictator is probably the best model. It's hard to find benign dictators though. Dubai has been a brilliant model of what you can achieve if you basically have everything owned by an individual who just runs the big picture. Singapore is quite similar. It is really a properly coordinated economy. And the interesting thing in Singapore is that the very top jobs in Singapore are government jobs. But you've got to have doctorates and you've got to have years of business experience, etc., before you're even allowed to come into government in Singapore. But it's run like a really professional business organization. Because if you don't get the revenue income, you can't disperse it for social requirements. And that's where it all starts. You've got to have the revenue before you can disperse it for your social requirements.
So we're not even scratching the surface of the potential of this country.
I don't think we're scratching the surface. And the biggest problem is there's no coordination between government departments as to how to put together a single plan that will optimize the country and not just optimize individual government departments. And it's the same. It's exactly the same as a business. I mean, if you have a business where your marketing department is selling stuff that your manufacturing guys aren't producing, and your manufacturing guys are producing stuff that your customers don't want, you don't have a business.
On the positive side, Collude has been a real superstar. What do you put that success down to?
There's really not much of a difference ultimately in the background between BA and Collude, because you're running it all within one company, and it's very hard even for us to say which is a more successful brand, because we really are extremely integrated with the two. We kind of balance according to what the market is looking for, as to where we put the capacity, etc. So it's a completely integrated model. Collude has been successful as a brand, very very strongly. So it's grown very aggressively. I think it was probably it's the novelty from the start. We came in first, and we really came in with a different model. And over time, we've managed to maintain a sort of a level of, I don't know what to call it, trust with the consumer. That we're not surviving through screwing the customer. We're surviving through continuous improvement in efficiency, etc., and then therefore being able to maintain competitive pricing in the market. That's the way to run a business long term. You got to keep the customers today, because they'll be probably the same people flying in 15 years' time.
And punctuality is obviously key to your business. Are you the most punctual airline in Africa?
We're running at the moment at about 89%, which is pretty good. I don't think there are many airlines that are at that kind of level.
On an SAA flight that arrived on time.
It's certainly better these days than years ago when we had older aircraft. So the new fleet has certainly raised the level of reliability and punctuality. But yeah, these days it's pretty good. There's always a chance that you get caught out for some reason for something, and the really strange scenarios are, for example, when someone's delayed on a flight out of Cape Town in the morning, and the flight departs at say 11 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock, and the explanation is that there was a thunderstorm in Johannesburg yesterday. Now you try and explain that to a customer, and the issue is that the thunderstorm yesterday meant that flights arrived in Cape Town late last night. The pilots aren't allowed to fly within 8 hours of their previous flight. They have to have a minimum rest period, and so they couldn't take off on time this morning because of a thunderstorm yesterday in Johannesburg. But you try and explain that to someone, and look at you like you've lost the plot. So yes, things do happen, but generally it's pretty good.
And the BA London, South African London flight, obviously still a strong line for you guys.
Yeah, look, we're operating only the domestic flights, BA domestic flights, but we do see a lot of the feed traffic coming in off the international flights. It's still a very strong route for BA, both London and Johannesburg. But again, not a lot of competition on that route, so that certainly helps them. But yeah, it's a good product. It's great connectivity out of Terminal 5 at Heathrow to most of Europe, rest of the world, etc. So yeah, it's a good product in a good geographic location, being situated in the UK.
The effects of good old Brexit?
Not really affecting South Africa. I don't think it's going to impact aviation much, quite honestly. All of those. The biggest concern was all of these route rights between the UK and other European countries. But the demand, ultimately it comes down to what is necessary to make economies work and what people need. And those routes are required for business between UK and Europe. And it's not, no one's going to all of a sudden say, okay, we're going to have to now cancel all the rights to fly between London and Paris, because it has to carry on. So there might be some tweaking here and there around the legalese of the clauses, but life will go on. Yeah.
And your peripheral businesses are doing well, the lounges, the cafes, catering, obviously nice to have side revenue coming in.
Absolutely. I think the real issue has just been that we've seen so little real economic growth in South Africa for such a long time. And aviation travel is usually a very good indicator of real economic growth. And we're talking about not in rand terms, but in dollar terms, in a genuine economic growth. And we're still sitting with the same passenger numbers within South Africa as what we saw back in 2008. We're sitting at about 13.5 million passengers a year. And I don't think there are many countries in the world that have had that level of stagnation in domestic air travel for such a long time. It is actually quite astonishing. So we've kept growing, and we've basically been eating away market share from other airlines. But the total market is stagnant. And so our real concern is just how long it is going to take before we see proper GDP growth again, and therefore we can't keep all our eggs in the aviation basket. We've got to find other areas to deliver financial growth for the company. So we had quite a few businesses where we'd insourced functions for our own purposes, like pilot training and catering. And as we built up the expertise in these businesses, we said, well, we started getting inquiries from outside to say, well, can't you actually train external pilots as well? Can't you provide catering to other airlines? And so that's really where we've gone now. But it's a relatively new phase for Comair, moving our internal expertise to external. So we're in the early days of growth there, but it's certainly a lot more lucrative than flying aeroplanes. The margins are quite startling compared to the aviation business. But it's doing very well. The airport lounges are doing really well. The catering business, we're looking at even producing products for retail and not for aviation catering. So there's scope in all those areas. And then the travel business has done well, but again, a bit constrained by the South African economy. So we're focusing now a lot more on the inbound tourism travel. Firstly, because it pays in dollars, which is always nice. So it's a real export product without having to go and establish a factory outside of South Africa. So I can't really think of many products that tick as many boxes for South Africa as inbound tourism, because it's based in South Africa, you're employing South Africans, you're earning foreign revenue, you're bringing big spend into the country. It's hugely labor intensive, and it should be sitting at the top of government's priorities is foreign tourism.
Absolutely. Skills development is obviously crucial for you guys. There are these new simulators. Are you seeing many female, black young pilots coming through the system?
Not as much as we'd like to see, and the astonishing bottleneck is actually matriculants with higher grade mathematics and science. So basically, to a large extent, a pilot is almost has to have an engineering aptitude and then be able to fly an aeroplane. So they do need the mathematics and the science, and typically you find the matriculants coming out with those degrees are rushing off into legal, doctors, businessmen, etc., and not that excited about becoming pilots. So we are going out there and really trying to get aviation into the schools, get people to think about aviation, and not just purely to come into aviation as a pilot, but all the other careers that sit in aviation. And there's everything there. There's everything from finance to HR to legal to call center, sales, marketing, and yes, there are also pilots and cabin crew. But yeah, it's quite a challenge to convince people because of that bottleneck in higher grade maths and science. Guys are coming out with those qualifications, they've got the world at their feet, and being a pilot doesn't always tick the top box. But we've turned out quite a few, and we're continuing. We've been involved in our cadet pilot scheme for 17 years now, which I think is the longest running cadet pilot scheme in the country as far as we're aware. And they all end up flying for Comair, and we're very happy.
Absolutely. Are you also training pilots from 36 other carriers?
Yeah, from all over the world. We've got Far East, Middle East, Africa, South America, India, Europe, There are various benefits. The one being that our cost structure here is relatively cheaper than training in Europe or other areas, so we can offer a very appealing package. We can offer the theoretical training as well as the flight simulator training, which means I don't have to go and do theoretical training one place, come and do simulator training, and then kind of debrief theoretically again somewhere else again. We can do the whole package in one place. And we've developed quite a good reputation in terms of quality, so it's growing nicely. We're now investing another 67 million in another building to house another 4 simulators, which will pretty much double our capacity for training. We're hoping to fill that up quickly.
And are you finding flying more and more appealing to the man on the street to actually, I mean, in terms of being a passenger, sort of people that would never be able to afford it and now slowly being able to afford to take it?
I think the relative cost of flying has come down dramatically. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen effectively a 70% drop in the cost of air travel in 15 years in South Africa. So the relative cost of air travel has become affordable. I remember when I was at university, over a period of 4 years, I flew up to Joburg to see my dad once because it cost me the equivalent of 4 months' allowance to buy a ticket to fly to Johannesburg. And my daughter's now here at university in Stellenbosch. It costs her the equivalent of 2 weeks' allowance. And I've worked out quite accurately that she's not getting a better allowance than I used to get for my living conditions. But that the relative cost of air travel has actually come down so much that I don't really cringe at the idea of flying home every once in a while. So yeah, definitely but it is still the catch is it is still a product for middle class market. It hasn't got to the point where it can really be a product for basic travel needs. And this is particularly an issue in Africa where we're seeing a slow growth in middle class in Africa, but it's still a very, very small middle class in Africa. And it's all comes back to this issue of economies of scale. If you can't get the volumes and you can't get the utilization of airport facilities, etc., then the price is very high. So you end up with relatively small aircraft flying on these African routes because there aren't volumes of middle class people to take up the seats. The airport utilization is relatively low, so the airport charges are very high. And so you've got this vicious circle where the cost of air travel in Africa is very high because the cost of operating in Africa is very high because the economies of scale are so poor.
Are you involved in the luxury charter side of the Comet business?
No, not at all. There is a company called Comet Flight Services, which was part of the original Comet group many, many years back. It's still got the Comet name attached, but it's not actually part of Comet Limited. But we do work very closely with them in terms of referrals for group travel and that kind of thing where we can't accommodate it, and they do a great service there of providing entire aircraft to transport big groups and that kind of thing.
Do you see a growth in that sort of luxury charter side just from the outside?
Not enormously. I think I think within Africa there's been quite a lot of demand for it because a lot of foreign companies are concerned about who they put their people onto, which carriers they put the people onto when flying within Africa. And so it all comes back to African GDP growth. If there's significant growth in African GDP and African businesses, then it's likely that initially we're going to see a lot more of that kind of charter work until you get a big enough middle class to justify really big airlines providing services to all these points in Africa. So maybe in the medium term, but it all comes back to basic economic growth. If that's not there, then you don't have people demanding to fly.
Your outlook for 2018, is the election going to be the big swinger?
Definitely. Everything really revolves around political policy. And our big focus is to get GDP growth up and going again, which all hinges on stable economic policies and stable politics. So it's a huge issue for the country, and ultimately it feeds through to us and to any business that's operating in South Africa.
In Joburg, you're saying no longer the hub? Do you think it has the potential to regain its status? Or
No, the world's moved on.
What would you say is the new gateway into Africa, or there are multiple gateways?
Look, you can go to Africa now is Dubai or Istanbul.
It's quite ironic for the country outside of Africa is the gateway.
It is, and if you want to go anywhere in the world, from anywhere in Africa. You can pick up a flight to Dubai or Istanbul and go to anywhere else in the world.
That's like a coup d'etat of the flight industry.
It is. But ultimately it's because African countries haven't stood together and established an African consortium or airline consortium to stand up to anyone else. So you have all these little 50-odd individual, small government-owned airlines all trying to compete with each other, and none of them have got the scale to do anything. And they all duplicate their costs, so they all have their own maintenance facilities, they all have their own training facilities, they all have their own air traffic control, they all have their own aircraft procurement. And as long as they're all operating in isolation, they all operate with 2 or 3 aeroplanes,
No chance.
it's futile, there's no chance.
And the Star Alliance, how would you rate their success?
I think the alliance model didn't deliver as much as what originally the concept was. It really was brought about because of the constraints on acquisition of airlines into sort of consolidation of airlines into a single ownership entities. So to bypass that, there was this concept of doing alliances and thereby somehow creating some kind of benefit. A lot of the issues that were originally thought of in alliances, such as joint procurement, also got thrown out as anti-competitive. So they were left really with frequent flyer benefits, being really the only thing left of value in an alliance. In case if you flew somewhere where your typical carrier didn't operate, hopefully there'd be an alliance carrier where you could still earn your miles. And that's pretty much all there was left of alliances, these days. So whether it really has much value, not so sure. We're seeing a lot of breakaways from alliances. So we're seeing concepts that we never dreamt that we'd see, like IAG Group, which is Iberia, BA, now Aer Lingus, doing code share agreements with low-cost carriers in like Virgin America. We'd never dreamt of seeing something like a BA doing a code share with a low-cost carrier in the first place. Never mind Virgin America. That is just sinful.
That's the main competition.
So exactly. So what is an alliance these days? Fundamentally, commercially, it doesn't honestly make sense. I think the only reason they still exist is because if they broke down the alliance, the frequent flyers would be tearing their hair out because of the day that they happen to want to fly in an area where their carrier doesn't operate and they won't get their points.
And the lack of non-stop flights from Cape Town, is that a thing to continue?
Well, look, the BA has filled the gap reasonably well.
Other than BA, there's not much else.
There's not much else.
Turkey.
But there's a huge constraint at the moment on airport infrastructure for large aircraft at Cape Town. So that's really the biggest constraint right now. Cape Town Airport can't accommodate Airbus A380s at all. And if you do fly in here, you got to hope you can get a remote parking bay, and there are chances that there won't even be capacity for a remote parking bay right now. So it is an infrastructure issue, and I know that AXA is working on it quite aggressively now to expand the parking for international carriers. So that's probably one of the bigger constraints right now with Cape Town Airport. But the demand to fly into Cape Town is big. Everyone wants to put more flights into Cape Town. I think the days of Johannesburg being the hub are over. People don't need to fly via Joburg to get to Cape Town these days, and they don't want to. So, from tourism perspective, Cape Town's got a huge leap ahead on Joburg. So, I expect before long you'll have more international traffic coming into Cape Town than Johannesburg, quite possibly.
Do you have a good relationship with AXA?
Yeah, generally we have a good relationship with AXA. It's depended quite a lot on who the shareholders have been over the years. So there was one period where a reported Roma was a shareholder, and they knew they were only in for a short period of time. So their view was just to get as much money out of AXA as fast as possible during their term as a shareholder, which was a really bad strategic situation for AXA to be in and for the airlines to be in as the victims of a reported Roma. But since they've moved out, unfortunately, they left a bit of that culture behind when they moved out, and the whole issue of short-term profit maximization, Uber, everything else, lived on for a while in AXA. But more recently, it's become much more rational and got a much better perspective on its own strategic goals as opposed to simply profit maximization in the short term.
And who decides who gets the closest bay to the terminal?
It's all very well statistically managed to ensure that everyone gets pretty much equal at the end of the day. So every airline's watching its allocations very carefully to make sure that no one gets better allocations than anybody else. So it's pretty, as a passenger, it's pretty much luck of the draw as to whether you're on the flight that happens to end up getting the closest on the day. But if you flew every day, you'd find that you'd get pretty much all equal.
So it's not SAA putting strings together?
No, not at all. No, in that regard, AXA's very unbiased. But we keep them in line there.
And this lawsuit now with 1.8 million rand possibly coming your way?
1.8 billion, yeah.
Billion, I beg your pardon.
1.9. Yeah, we've the ruling has already been made by the South Gauteng High Court, but SA decided to take it on appeal. So our award was about 60% of the full potential. So we said, well, if SA is going to take it on appeal, then we might as well take it on appeal as well for the balance.
Exactly.
So hopefully we get the appeal hearing heard in early 2018.
It's almost like the courts are running the country these days.
Yeah, it's quite tragic, and I think it is indicative of the fact that so many cases where the public or private sector gets involved with government end up having to be resolved through legal process. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
It ties into what you're saying about government not putting the economy first all the time.
And also, I think it also comes back to the lack of business acumen within government. And there is this big disconnect between business and government. And the challenge now is, how do you build that trust again? Because to a large extent, the business community is saying, well, every time we deal with government, something goes wrong and we end up having to go to court to either get paid or to complete the contracts or whatever is necessary. So do we honestly want to deal with government? It's too much of a risk. We can't afford it. When you spend money on a contract and you don't get paid, you go bust. Will you do it a second time? And then government comes up with the opposite view and says, well, we can't trust capital. So that somehow that trust has got to be built again. But I think it needs real understanding of how business operates. Government needs to really understand what is fundamentally necessary to make business work.
Like Cyril Ramaphosa with a more business acumen.
Absolutely, could be very valuable.
That would be good for your business.
For sure, it would be good for everyone in South Africa.
And as a family man, finally, how do you balance family and work life?
Look, I've got a really good team at work, so these days I don't have to do everything myself anymore. I know that if something's happening there, I can leave it. There's someone in charge who knows it fits into their portfolio, and they'll deal with it. They'll keep me up to date, and if they need me there, I'll be there. But someone once, I think I can't remember, it might have been Michael Lopeshaw or someone who once said that being CEO is the best job and the worst job in the world. Because on the one hand, you've kind of got a lot of control over your time and how you manage your work, but on the other hand, when things really hit the fan, you're the one who has to deal with it. But no, I think I've got a really good team there, so it's not that everything rests on my shoulders, and we can all kind of, I think one of the big principles we push quite hard in Comair is that we don't have ridiculous short-term expectations on workload, because again, it's one of these issues of long-term versus short-term. You can only do it for so long, working it for a ridiculous amount of time under intolerable pressure, not seeing your family for a reasonable period every week, etc. And after a while, people burn out and they leave, and that doesn't help us in the long term. If we only had a 3-4 year time frame, I'd say fine, work everyone to death for 3 years, and after 3 years, I'm gone, and who cares? But I've been there now for 21 years, and who knows, I might be there for another 21 years, in which case I want the people who are working with me today to still be there. And if I burn them out today, they're not going to be there. And
what's your employer satisfactory index?
There are lots of ways to sort of measure it. We have done employee engagement surveys, and the sort of benchmark that we've been told is that people who rate for high employee engagement is typically around 20%. It's a very typical curve normally, where you get high engagement about 20%, you get moderately engaged for the bulk of the curve, and then you get completely disengaged for about 20%. When we did the survey, we came out as high engaged at 47%, which we're pretty happy with. And then we always had that kind of 20% at the tail end that is disengaged. But I think one of the hurdles for people entering aviation is that they typically come into the bottom end as airport staff, check-in staff, cabin, entry-level cabin crew, etc. And people have to get over the hurdle of whether this is really for them or it isn't. Because at the start of the career, it's a tough job. You're working to extremely tight deadlines all the time at the airports. You get abuse from customers. It's a tough job. And we typically find that at about 18 months, people take that decision as to whether this is for them or isn't for them. And at that point in time, and sort of up to that point in time, you get a lot of people who are very indecisive as to whether they pick the right career choice. But once they get over the 18-month hurdle, then they're in. And then you see that sort of buy-in to the Comet culture and what's important, etc. And then they're really engaged and they're going for the next job and the next sort of promotion and the next opportunities and self-development and all that kind of stuff. So, we're always going to see that entry-level component where people are still not sure if this amount of customer interaction and these kind of issues are what they really want to deal with for the rest of their careers.
You've got to be a patient person.
You've got to be a patient person for most jobs in aviation. And then, like I said, once they get over that hurdle of saying, yes, this is actually what I want to do, then then they're in for life. And we've got, if you work out the total proportion of staff that are over 10 years service, we're sitting at over 50% of our staff with more than 10 years service in Comair.
A lot of experience.
So it's a lot of experience, and that counts for a lot.
Thanks for your time, sir.
Pleasure.